The issue in Timbs versus Indiana is the incorporation of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, actually a particular clause of the Eighth Amendment that prohibits excessive fines. Mr. Timbs was convicted of several drug crimes in Indiana. Under Indiana state law, the absolute maximum he could have been penalized for all of these crimes was about $10,000. However, using civil asset forfeiture, law enforcement in the state of Indiana seized his truck, which was worth $40,000, because they argued that the drugs he was transporting in the truck itself. The incorporation doctrine argues that all of these fundamental rights, which cannot be violated by the federal government, also cannot be violated by state governments. So it's true that the folks in Washington, D.C. can't do things that unreasonably violate your First Amendment right, your Second Amendment right, your Fourth Amendment right. But it's also true that the folks in Sacramento or Austin or Albany can't do this either. The extent of incorporation is unclear, however, because rather than simply incorporating all of the amendments, the Supreme Court has in piecemeal fashion incorporated them amendment by amendment, sometimes clause by clause in each amendment. And in fact, that's what we are dealing with here. Certain parts of the Eighth Amendment have been incorporated, such as the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Certain parts have not been, such as the prohibition against excessive fines. This is a doctrine that the Supreme Court has developed over time. And in fact, there are still people to this day who wonder whether or not incorporation itself is a misreading of the 14th Amendment, and none of these rights should be read against the state capitals. I think that the more significant debates are not about whether or not incorporation is legitimate, but about how to incorporate. So the most obvious way to incorporate an amendment to the Constitution is through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. You would argue that there are certain rights that are fundamental to American history, and that as a matter of due process, those rights must be respected by the federal government, but they also must be respected by the state governments. There's an alternative argument, though, that says under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, there are certain privileges or certain immunities that you have as an American. And because you have them as an American, they extend from state to state. They also extend from the federal jurisdiction to any state jurisdiction. The best argument for Mr. Timbs is that when you can be punished at most by a $10,000 fine, to effectively be punished with a $40,000 penalty is simply disproportionate and violates the Eighth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment is incorporated just like all the other amendments are. There must be some kind of limit on what the government can seize through asset forfeiture. In this case, his truck is worth 4 times the amount of what he could have been punished with, given the underlying crime, but it could have been worth even more. It didn't have to be a truck. It could have been a yacht, it could have been an airplane, it could have been any number of things. Mr. Timbs is arguing that there must be some limiting principle. The best argument for the state of Indiana is that the thing that the Eighth Amendment prohibition against excessive fines is contemplating is literally excessive fines, not asset forfeiture, which is actually a law enforcement technique rather than some kind of a criminal penalty. The Supreme Court has dealt with civil asset forfeiture in the past and has said that it's not unconstitutional. It's something that law enforcement is engaged in as part of protecting public safety in the community. We don't want criminals to be able to profit from their ill-gotten gains, so we empower law enforcement to take those ill-gotten gains from them. They're arguing that an actual fine or fee imposed by the state of Indiana is the kind of thing that's subject to the Eighth Amendment, but a law enforcement tactic like civil asset forfeiture is not the kind of thing that's contemplated by the amendment, and therefore, it's not incorporated. The fundamental question in this case is whether or not there are any restrictions on the kinds of criminal financial penalties that state governments can levy against their citizens. And in the course of answering that very important question, the Supreme Court is also going to clarify a number of things about the constitutionality of the practice of civil asset forfeiture in the United States.